Okay, so we are 10 o'clock on the dot here, so I will jump in and get started with today's webinar. First of all, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. My name is Kelsey Scarfone with Environmental Defense, and joining me this morning is my lovely co-host, Anastasia Littner with Canadian Environmental Law Association. So just before we get started, I'll go over some basic housekeeping items and just let you all know that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to all of you as registrants, and it'll be also posted and made available as a public resource. So keeping that in mind, especially if you've phoned in this morning from a landline or a cell phone, please make sure to keep your line muted for the duration of the webinar. But you've all been muted automatically upon logging in, so that should be fine, but just as a reminder on that, so we don't have any feedback in the recording and it can be used after the fact as a resource. We would sincerely like to thank all of you for your interest in the webinar. We've had quite a range and a diversity in registrants and participants this morning. So folks calling in from fellow ENGOs, from community groups, we have some concerned citizens on the line, conservation authorities, as well as governments. So a real range that we really appreciate. And so with that in mind, we'll be making sure to give a good overview of exactly what COA is. Many of you on the call are very familiar. It may be brand new to some of you, so we want to make sure to give that good overview of what it is, why it's important, and also detailing the significant changes that we've taken note of in the draft that was released for public comment on July 5th, earlier this month. So with all of that in mind, we'll get started here by looking at our agenda. So looking at our agenda, we're going to start, like I said, with an overview, as I mentioned, and then go right into the draft agreement. What were the standout items? And we'll also share some of the messages that Environmental Defense has put out so far with our supporters and the broader public about this draft COA. We'll quickly review timelines, and then we've set aside a good amount of time for question and answer. And so the aim of this webinar is really to provide information on COA, on why it's important, highlight the changes we've noted, and really provide this information as a resource so all of you feel informed and like you have a good overview to either make public comments or sign on to public comments and engage your networks as well in this important renegotiation that's currently underway. So we've made sure to set aside a good amount of time for Q&A, knowing that there probably will be a lot of questions, which is great, and we really encourage that. As they come up through the presentation, feel free to put them into the Q&A box, and then we will address them in order during the question and answer portion. So we hope today's information will be helpful to you as part of the submission process and the public comment process. And likewise, we anticipate that your questions and your feedback may help us inform a submission that addresses a broad range of concerns from the community. And that submission will be circulated as a resource or for endorsements closer to the September 4th deadline for public comment, as it's now posted both on the federal website, but also on the Environmental Registry of Ontario until September 4th. So with all of that in mind, it is now my pleasure to turn it over to Anastasia Littner. Anastasia is Special Projects Counsel for Healthy Great Lakes at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. So thank you so much, Anna. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kelsey. As everybody is thinking through if you have questions as they pop up, as Kelsey said, make sure that you type them into the question box. If we don't get to all of the questions, or if you just want to make comments or just want to provide us with input, that is all going to be collected, and we're going to be making use of it as we move forward. And this is an opportunity to kind of get your ideas out to us, and not just about the COA itself, but also about are there things that Environmental Defense or Canadian Environmental Law Association can do to help support you? Are there things that you need to better understand what's going on? Let us know those things. We can't guarantee we can do everything that everybody would like us to do, but we definitely want to be here as a resource and support as you take the opportunity to raise your voices in response to this proposed new agreement. Before I jump into the proposed new agreement, I do want to acknowledge that I'm actually sitting in my office in Kingston. This is an important meeting area between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe traditionally, and is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And this law, the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, is many, many centuries old. It is a commitment to share the Great Lakes, and certainly Lake Ontario and the region and the basin, that there is only one dish and that we need to take care of it and also share from it forever. And that's an important law, important commitment. And as settlers came to this land, we were all invited into respecting and holding ourselves to that treaty. And I think that's a good frame in which we start thinking about the Canada-Ontario Agreement. And what is it? It's a agreement between the federal government and the provincial government that they will work together to achieve a joint vision for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence ecosystem. The first agreement was in 1971, so it actually predates the first Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between Canada and the US. It's an effort to have these two parties, the federal government and the provincial government, who under the Canadian Constitution share jurisdiction over water and have recognized the need that you have to coordinate and collaborate and integrate your efforts if you're really going to achieve a vision for the Great Lakes. And so in this agreement, as it has been renewed many times since 1971, it articulates what the federal and the provincial government will be doing to achieve the purpose or the vision of the agreement. And it matters that this agreement is a strong commitment because it is that way in which the federal government and the provincial government take action, but not just take action individually, which they can always do, but how they're going to collaborate, integrate, and make sure that public resources are spent effectively in achieving a goal or a vision. And the one for the Great Lakes region, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed as a whole, has been to protect and restore the waters within the ecosystem, protect and restore the ecosystem, and focus on the health of the ecosystem. It's been the way in which these commitments are articulated. So if you've ever looked at one, there's sort of both parties, Canada and Ontario, will do this. Canada will do this, Ontario will do that. It's sort of figuring out whose responsibilities are what around the various priorities, and it's a way in which resources can be flowed towards achieving particular goals. I think you can go to the next one, I think now, Kelsey. I'm going on to the structure, I think. Yes. So in terms of the agreement itself, it's an agreement between Canada and Ontario, and as I said, we've seen it evolve over time such that it's connected to the Canada and the US agreement. So between Canada and the US, there's the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is now currently called the Great Lakes Water Quality Protocol of 2012. Within Ontario, we have our commitments under the Great Lakes Protection Act and Ontario's Great Lakes Strategy. And so it's evolved that each of the parties is acting under their jurisdictions and their commitments this way. But it originally started as a commitment that a recognition that there needed to be efforts together on water protection, restoration, rehabilitation within the whole region. And the structure of each agreement is that there are articles, sort of the main body of the agreement, where there's a preamble. It says, why you're doing this. There's some definitions. There's the overall purpose of the agreement. There's the principles that the parties want to hold themselves to. There's some administrative commitments around how they're going to work together, so with committees and leads and so on. There's commitments around reporting, resources, when they need to notify each other about particular things, how they're going to do any amendments if those are needed, how they're going to avoid disputes and what they'll do if disputes come up, and then a commitment about how long it will be enforced. And each time these have been 5-year commitments. The current Canada-Ontario agreement will be enforced until mid-December of this year. So I think it's December 17th, 2019. And within the articles or with the main body of the agreement, there's also a commitment around what they call annexes. And the annexes are the specific priorities. So they've identified the priority areas that they want to work on. And in the main body of the articles or the agreement, it says what each of the annexes will contain. And in the agreements, it usually says, that the annex will contain a purpose and some commitments and kind of how they're going to work together on that particular priority. So what we see in the new draft agreement is that there's been some changes in the annexes, proposed changes in the annexes. Instead of having a separate science in an annex, it's all going to be integrated throughout everything. So science has been moved from having a kind of separate annex on the end to being within the main body of the agreement. There's a commitment that the two parties will conduct, maintain, focus, and coordinate science to contribute to the achievement of the purpose of the Canada-Ontario agreement. So that's one of the changes that we've seen. There's also a new annex. It's the wastewater and stormwater annex. So elevating a priority around making sure that we are looking specifically at wastewater and stormwater and the issues that are associated with that, including concerns about road salts and flooding and so on. And we have seen one more aspect of the annexes that is being proposed to change is that taking out a commitment of promoting innovation and the commitment of engaging communities, bringing innovation out to the main body of the agreement, and having an annex around awareness and action. So moving from awareness to action is an annex that's replacing basically what was called engaging communities before. One of the things that I recognize that CELA and Environmental Defense are recognizing is that it is no small feat for two governments to work together and get to a draft agreement in such a short period of time. Early in the year, it was we were getting the sense that there would be quite a long time until there'd be negotiated a draft agreement, but the parties got together in very short order and were able to get a draft agreement out for comment. The challenge with that, with moving so quickly, is that there was not very much engagement with the interested publics in bringing together this draft agreement for the public to comment on now. There was a meeting early in the year that the federal government hosted, and then a webinar that both Ontario and Canada hosted, where there was very short notice and we didn't have much information in advance. And that was our sort of first time finding out that things were moving very quickly and that we'd be seeing a draft agreement in very short order. So moving very quickly at the expense of engagement. And a missed opportunity that in some initial comments that Environmental Defense and WWF Canada and Canadian Environmental Law Association put forward is that in our era of reconciliation, it's hoped that there'll be a shift from just Canada and Ontario making these agreements to Canada, Ontario, and all the nations in the basin that were here before settlement of Canada. So I see that as a bit of a missed opportunity. So the last thing I'll say about the new reconfiguration is that specifically we have seen an elevation of a priority around the addition of plastic pollution. And then I think we can go on to the next slides, Kelsey.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Anna. I thought it might be a good opportunity to just jump in really quickly. I know quite a few folks have joined since my initial housekeeping spiel, so I'll just give you a break from talking at it really quickly to welcome everyone that's just joined. Just letting everyone know that this webinar is being recorded to share all of with you after the fact, but also will be made available as a public resource. So if you phoned in, just make sure to keep your line muted. You've all been, I think, muted automatically coming into the webinar. So just a quick reminder about that. Please feel free, everyone, to, as questions are popping up, feel free to type them right away into the question and answer box, and we'll make sure to get them to them kind of in order when we come to that portion of the webinar. So yes, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in Zoom webinar here. And just one more time, really appreciate the diversity in the groups and governments, municipal folks, conservation authorities, other NGOs, concerned citizens that have all tuned in today. So we really appreciate that range of interested parties. So just a quick reminder on the housekeeping piece, as a lot of you have tuned in now since my initial spiel, and I will turn it back to keep talking about, to Anna, to keep talking about the standout changes that we've noticed in the 2014 COA, or since the 2014 COA in the 2019 draft COA.
Thanks, Kelsey. So I have already been articulating the differences in what the articles are and what the annexes are, and how we've seen some changes in moving science from being a separate annex to being pursued on everything. So it's been moved to an article or to the main body. We see some changes in the accountability measures. So there are proposed to be less, it's going to be less administratively heavy, which is not necessarily good or bad. It depends on how effective the structure is. In the current Canada-Ontario agreement signed in 2014, there is an executive and a management committee and a chemicals management committee and annex leads. And this will be focused in on having an executive committee and annex leads. So there'll be that kind of change in the administration. There will be a shift in how the reporting is going to be done. The reporting previously had been commitments to joint reporting, and what we're seeing is a shift in this to a proposal that there will be reporting, each of the parties reporting separately under their own mechanism. So federally, they'll be reporting under the Canada, or under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement with the US, provincially reporting as required by the Great Lakes Protection Act. And as I said earlier, the great thing about COA is that it is the commitments between Canada and Ontario about how they will be working together within the basin to protect and restore water quality and ecosystem health. And so it doesn't need to be limited in any way to any other agreements or any other arrangements. It can be sort of whatever they're willing to work on together. And so it's important that if there are things that they're committing to working on together, that they also report on them jointly. And presumably, there might be opportunities to ensure that, you know, there's reporting mechanisms that aren't onerous, but that can both address kind of what each party is doing individually, but also what they're doing jointly, which may or may not be caught in the other types of reporting mechanisms. On the issue of how they're setting out what's going to be accomplished. We've seen a shift from lots of specificity and very clear timelines and targets that were under not the 2014 agreement, but under the 2002 agreement, where there were specific 5-year goals with results and requirements around ensuring that there were timeframes and measurable outcomes and naming the responsible party and commitments to monitoring reporting within each of the annexes. So lots of specificity and clear articulation of what's going to be achieved. And we see that in 2014, there was a change to, rather than all of that specificity, to setting sort of the aspirational long-term goals and the results that they want to achieve within this, within that 5-year cycle. And in the proposed agreement, a little bit less clear about what the ambition is or what the long-term goal or purpose is, as we shift to just reporting or just requiring that there be results. And the results, having results-based accountability makes a lot of sense, as long as the results that are being committed to have some clarity and specificity, so you can measure if you've achieved that result. And there are some good ones and there are some not so good ones that are within the draft. For example, if we look at the Annex on nutrients, which is the proposed Annex 1, there's a result that says that there'll be an establishment of phosphorus concentration and loading targets for priority tributaries, near shore and offshore waters of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And that is something that at the end of 5 years, okay, we could say, were they established? There might be some questions about what will be the priority tributaries and so on, but it's something that in its articulation, we'd be able to measure if that's been achieved. Another one of the results says increased understanding, development, and adoption of practices and technologies to reduce the risk of excess nutrient loss from agricultural production consistent with a sustainable and competitive agricultural sector. And that one's less clear about, would we know if we've achieved that result? And so one of the things that we are thinking about is, are there ways to make sure that as we shift to kind of results-based annexes that don't have this kind of overarching clear goal. There are purpose statements, but it doesn't kind of give us the longer term ambition that we're trying to achieve and what we'll do within this 5 years. Having just the results and not having them articulated in a way that's very clear that's certainly a way that the agreement could be strengthened. And the aspects of how it's being funded or resourced, in the 2002 agreement, there was a commitment that was very clear to provide the resources to implement the agreement. In 2014, there is a caveat or a qualification on providing the resources for implementation that says that the resources will be provided to implement subject to appropriation in either Parliament or legislature as appropriate. And in doing that, and the way in which appropriations or budgeting is communicated publicly, it's very, very challenging to figure out what were the funding commitments and amounts that were made towards implementation of this particular set of commitments. There's no Great Lakes budget, federally or provincially, and it's a huge transparency challenge, because if you want to try and figure that out, which we've been trying to do at Canadian Environmental Law Association, just looking at publicly available reporting from the provincial and federal governments, it's very, very challenging to get a handle on sort of what progress was made with a weakening of reporting, and also how much investment or public resources were committed and spent on achieving those goals. And so overall, we are in our assessment so far, which we're continuing to do, we have some concerns or some suggestions about how to strengthen Great Lakes Canada-Ontario Agreement by increasing the accountability, by setting the ambitious goals that we're trying to get to long-term, because each 5-year work plan, we hope, is moving us towards sort of these longer-term commitments and goals, and ensuring that there really are adequate investments that, as the interested public, we can see how those investments are being made and whether or not they're adequate. And I think that's it for what I was going to say on this.
Okay,
back over to you, Kelsey.
Fabulous, thank you. Sorry, my slides are a bit delayed in their transition. Okay, so next, now that it's out for public comment, I want to quickly just talk about some of the public messaging on this file that EDC has put out there so far. This will have varying relevance to folks on the call, but I thought it was just really, quickly worth touching on the things that we've been sharing so far. So this is a good kind of segue off of the pieces that Anna was just talking about. What we're really focusing on in our public messaging, and what we're telling our supporters what we would like to see in this agreement are these 3 main things. So one being ambitious goals that have all of the important elements that, in some places we've noticed they're lacking in the draft, as Anna mentioned. So we want to see them time-bound, measurable, and also with adequate investment. So we've adopted this 100 million per year number, not off the top of our heads, but actually in sort of a takeaway from the Great Lakes St. Lawrence collaborative strategy. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the collaborative strategy, it's a process that has been steered by 5 really great Great Lakes focused organizations, but also was a process where many ANGOs, conservation authorities, industry, municipal governments, and many different groups were able to participate on issue tables in 4 different issue areas. So they were nutrients, beaches and bacteriological contamination, toxics, and climate change. So their report is now out, and I encourage you to kind of look at it if you're interested. It's the Action Plan 2030 for the Great Lakes, and they are recommending $100 million per year investment in order to address these challenges in an adequate way. So that's been a really great resource for us to point to and say, this is the type of investment we need to see in the Great Lakes, and really inspired by, if you're familiar with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in the States, has led to some really fabulous outcomes on the US side, and has really strong bipartisan support for that funding. So, and you can sort of see that money and know where it's going and see the impact it's making. And we really need that adequate and transparent investment in Canada. So that's been a great tool. And then third being the accountability measures we just talked about, including the commitment to transparent reporting of the implementation in this agreement. And I just want to emphasize Anna's earlier point that that this is our domestic plan. This can be ambitious. It can go above and beyond the requirements that we have in our agreement with the US. We can aim higher in terms of our ambition in solving these issues that plague our Great Lakes. And so that's what we're really talking about when we're putting these, 1, 2, 3 pieces out to the public. And we're really so far encouraging, and I won't spend a lot of time here. These items are on the internet, and I can link them to you, send them to you if you're interested in reading more. But we've put out a blog about how the Great Lakes are facing more and more threat every day, and we need to have a plan that has that same level of urgency and ambition in dealing with them. We also have started a letter writing campaign, really encouraging our supporters to participate in the ongoing public process. So it's helping our supporters engage in the environmental registry, and pointing them to the federal consultation as well. And then in terms of another great public resource that's coming soon, and is of course, I think of more interest to folks on this call, is that submission that will be made available to you, and you'll be able to either use it as a resource in drafting your own comments, potentially sign on to that as an endorsement. But we really hope it'll help folks feel informed, and CELA, for folks who've worked with CELA before, as you know, just an amazing resource in terms of providing that great analysis and information to help people engage in this way from an informed position. In terms of timelines, we wanted to give everyone a really quick look at the timelines that we're working with on COA so far in terms of the renegotiation process. The first deadline that we have top of mind here is September 4th, as mentioned, is when this public comment period closes. And then in the fall, of course, we have a federal election, and we do not anticipate that there will be much activity on this renegotiation or on this file until after the federal election. Then looking forward past October and past the fall, the other time to keep in mind is, as Anna mentioned, December 17th, where our current COA is set to expire. So now is the long-awaited question and answer period. Just a reminder to put your questions in the chat. We just had a quick question that I'll address now to provide a link to the action plan. I can certainly do that and send that to everyone as part of the follow-up correspondence from the webinar, so no problem there.
And also, I popped it into the chat box for those that are watching live.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you, Anastasia. There it is. So you can link to it right now if you're so inclined. Okay, great. So we have one question here that says, have there been any meaningful changes to the articles on the purpose and principles in the draft COA?
And I can say that the principles and the purpose are substantially the same as they were. I'm pretty sure there haven't been any amendments to the principles and the purpose overall that were between 2014 and the proposed 2020.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'll just give folks a moment to put some more questions in the box. We're not seeing any right now. And of course, it could be that folks are just hearing this information for the first time and don't need a little bit of time to sort of digest it and come back with questions. And so we want to make ourselves available to you. And so maybe I'll pull up the slide now that has our contact information. This is just a summary slide on the things we talked about. And this is our contact information here. So both of our email addresses are here. Please feel free to reach out to us with further questions, or if you're interested in engaging on this further. So a few more questions here. We have a question that asks, do you have any specific funding recommendations for those areas that are lacking funding?
And the short answer to that is because there isn't transparent reporting on how the funding flows and to which things, it's really challenging to determine where, if we wanted to say, we need lots more investment within the Great Lakes region on nutrients or on toxics or on this or on that, because that's not the way that the investment reporting gets made available to us. So I don't have a good answer for that at the moment, but it certainly folds into the concern that has been expressed before, certainly by Canadian Environmental Law Association, that we'd like to understand what spending is being done on the Great Lakes and then be able to assess where we need more investments beyond just saying, look, this is the health of the system, and these are the things that are getting worse or better. We need to know more, to understand that whole cycle. And that's a challenge. There's no doubt that's a challenge, because at the same time that I'm saying, oh, I want transparent funding around how transparent information around how Great Lakes spending goes, it's also important that many, many different ministries take on responsibilities for Great Lakes commitments, and that I'm sure makes it challenging to report on it. But it is something that it's very hard to tease out, and so I don't have any ideas right at the moment about how investment should be directed.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And our next question here is there a plan to integrate management in Quebec, i.e. the St. Lawrence? Is there a parallel initiative? So I will say that there is a similar agreement between Quebec and Canada, but I'll let Anna sort of detail if there's any kind of nuances and any differences.
So my reaction to the question is there's a continued work through the Great Lakes St. Lawrence collaborative strategy. There's a shift now to the St. Lawrence River and to Quebec, and a whole process going on to get to some high-level priority recommendations around actions and spending that could happen for the St. Lawrence. So that initiative is ongoing. In terms of how Quebec and Ontario might collaborate, I'm not aware of any efforts to move on that kind of coordination. But there is, as Kelsey said, there's Canada-Ontario agreement, there's Canada-Quebec agreement. Within the collaborative strategy that was mentioned, where there's an action plan, there will be one for the St. Lawrence coming out.
Okay, great. This next question is actually from the chat box, so I'll just grab this question quickly, and then we'll get back to the next question in the Q&A box. Is there a role to advocate for some public or NGO members on the COA Executive Committee? I will jump in and say I think that would be great. Any thoughts, Anna?
No, I was thinking the same thing. Hadn't thought about commenting on the management structure, but having interested public represented on annexes and on the management committee is something that I definitely will take into consideration in terms of our advocacy work.
Absolutely. Thanks for that question. Next question is, I noticed a reference to thermal treatment of plastics. Most NGOs, ENGOs are against this. Do you plan to comment on it? I can say for environmental defense, we are one of those ENGOs that are against it. And yes, that would come up in our comments for sure. And that's a great note, great flag.
I don't have anything further to add on that one.
Great. Follow-up question from a previous question on the funding piece. And the follow-up question is, should we be asking in our submissions for details of all the relevant funding so we can later identify gaps in the quantum of additional funding that is needed to properly address the requirements under the agreement?
Yeah, I think that is something that Canadian Environmental Law Association has sent in a request similar to that, and it's certainly something that we'll be considering as we start to develop the submission in terms of continuing to ask for that kind of transparency or information gathering so that we can make more concerted, targeted comments on that area for sure.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add there. In the same, but I think that's an important part of the submissions, is looking for that transparency. Our next question is, are there First Nations representatives on the executive committee? And I don't know.
And I don't know off the top of my head either. I suspect that the executive committee is just the reps from the two parties. Yes, assistant deputy ministers, regional director generals, senior regional representatives from department, ministries, and agencies. So there's nothing in the current COA that suggests on the executive committee there's anything but the parties being represented.
Mm-hmm. And I think this question sort of flags that piece, Anastasia, that you spoke to earlier on moving to an agreement that is Canada, Ontario, nation, that sort of approach to policy that we know is new, but I think what a good place to with this agreement to start moving in that direction. And so maybe representation on that committee could be a part of that. So it's a good question. Thank you for that. Next question here. To what extent has the climate change annex been revised? For example, with respect to increasing resiliency to flooding and other extreme weather? Great question. I know flooding is a top of mind issue for many of us in the basin with such record high water levels.
And I will just confess at the moment that from Canadian environmental law's perspective, we haven't done the deep dive on all the annexes yet, so I don't have an easy answer to the question at the moment, but it's something that I really appreciate drawing it to our attention so that when we're doing that assessment, the title, Climate Change Impacts and Resilience, is, what are the new commitments, what are the additional results that we can see, and are they going to get us where we need to go? We haven't done that assessment yet, but it is definitely important to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. Okay. Were there any other questions that maybe have emerged now from anyone on the call, on the webinar this morning, that we haven't addressed so far? Oh, here we are. Does the new COA strengthen federal or provincial commitments to fund initiatives put on by municipal or other partners to advance delisting areas of concern?
So in terms of the annex on the areas of concern, it is substantially improved. It's one of the ones that I have had a chance to really look at carefully. So there's very clear commitments. They're talking about all of the areas of concern and kind of prioritizing which ones they're trying to get delisted in the next 5 years. So in terms of the intent within the annex, we see lots of good things. And then the concern remains that, as I said, on resources generally, the resources, there's a proposed commitment to resourcing implementation, which would be implementing this areas of concern annex, which is looking really good, with the qualification or caveat that it would have to be appropriated through Parliament or through the provincial legislature. So there will remain this concern, the overarching concern we have about everything, is we don't know that there'll be enough investment to achieve what they have proposed within the areas of concern annex.
Great. The next question is, in the past, there have been requests from CELA, Environmental Defense, and ourselves, GBA, for additions to the chemicals of concern. Are you intending to repeat those requests in your submissions?
So I think this is speaking to efforts between Canada and Ontario under the Great Lakes Water Quality Protocol of 2012 and the chemicals of mutual concern. There have been efforts to get some chemicals listed. so that they will be worked on under the binational or the agreement between Canada and the US. And that effort is continuing. There's a network called Toxics Free Great Lakes is working on sort of the chemicals management and those concerns in terms of that way in which we address the issues between Canada and the US. And within Ontario, in terms of the Canada-Ontario agreement, there's no reason, there's no limitation that we have to only think about how we're implementing the agreement between Canada and the US. So there can be work on chemicals, on substances that are of concern, the toxics, the pollution that are deeply concerning, and how it's getting into the waterways within Ontario that can be worked on. They don't have to kind of go matched exactly. And we'll definitely, it's anticipated from Canadian Environmental Law Association's perspective that we'll be working on developing some recommendations for that annex and strengthen it.
Yeah, and the only thing I have to add on my end is that we have the toxics program at Environmental Defense as well would probably be keen to be looping them into this conversation around the submission as well. So that'll be an area we keep in mind. Next question is that the current Ontario government has cut funding for flooding and also tree planting, which could help mitigate flooding. Do you plan to comment on these recent actions, including the weakness of the current Provincial Climate Action Plan, which seem to run counter to the spirit of this agreement? I'll start off answering this question by saying that there was a MNR-led flooding resilience consultation that took place a few weeks back earlier in the spring, and we did submit joint comments, CELA and Environmental Defense, as well as 20 other organizations who signed on to endorse the letter as part of that flooding resiliency consultation that really pointed that exact thing out, that we need to be investing in programs like tree planting and investing in our conservation authorities, enabling them to take on integrated watershed management activities. And so I think that we will reference back to some of those comments we've provided so far, and making sure that resiliency comes from not just the shoreline, but throughout the watershed. Do you have anything to add there, Anastasia?
Nope.
Okay. Our next question is, could we consider whether microplastics could be nominated as a chemical of mutual concern? I think that's a very interesting question.
I think, yeah, definitely it's worth consideration, and we can flag it for, particularly for Toxics Free Great Lakes Network, which is sort of taking the lead on how the toxics work is being done within the basin binationally and within Ontario.
Fabulous. The next question is, will you post questions and summary of verbal answers? So we are going to be posting the entire recording to be made available for any who are interested. That's something that we could look at doing if that would be helpful. Otherwise, it would be, we could note the time in the recording that we review the questions and when that happens. But we will be.
I was thinking similarly, this is sort of in that area of what would be helpful to support people as they start thinking through their own submissions or how to get involved. So we'll definitely be considering how, sort of what materials can we provide and what's helpful. And that was kind of in my mind about, is there a role for us to kind of answer some of these questions so the person doesn't have to listen to the whole webinar if they're not interested in everything, but might be interested in some of the specific questions. So definitely be thinking about that. Not sure what we can commit to at the moment, but thanks for the comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this has been really great to see such a wide range of interest engagement from so many folks this morning. We have about 10 minutes left if anyone has a burning question they haven't been able to ask so far. I'll give that.
And this isn't the end of the opportunities to talk with us about it or let us know your interests or concerns or questions. As Kelsey said, we've put both of our email addresses up there, and we'll be continuing to work on the file and communicating out between now and the comment period ending on September 4th.
Yes, please feel free to get in touch with us if you're keen to continue engaging on this. And as registrants on this webinar, we will make sure to circulate materials as they become available to further provide resources and continually answer any questions that you might have. And I'll just say, sort of hearing your questions has really given us a good sense of where a broad range of stakeholders are at with this draft agreement. So we sincerely thank you for taking the time. I know it's a busy time of year, a lot of vacations, a lot going on. We hope that you'll all have an opportunity to enjoy our beautiful Great Lakes this summer. We do have one more question, which I'll just read out now. In addition to making higher level comments, what suggestions do you have for local ENGOs when making submissions in order to include a local focus? So local examples of flooding, water quality, and there could be others that are important to your local region.
Yeah, I think one way to think about it is to just look at what are the priorities that are being proposed, and are these issues coming up within your community. So the way that's structured, if you haven't yet had a chance to look at one of these, is there are 5 priority areas. The first priority is protecting water. The second is improving coastal areas. The third is protecting habitat and species. The fourth is exchanging understanding and adaptation. And the fifth is engaging communities from awareness to action. Within those priorities, they've set out the proposed annexes. So for protecting waters, we've got nutrients, harmful pollutions, the new wastewater and stormwater concerns, and discharges from vessels. Under improving coastal areas, we have areas of concern and the lake-wide management annexes. Under protecting habitat and species, we have aquatic invasive species and habitat and species protection more generally. And under enhancing and understanding adaptation, we have water quality, groundwater quality, and we have climate change impacts and resilience. And then the last one, the last priority of engaging communities from awareness to action, there's the from awareness to action annex, and then separate annexes for the Métis and for First Nations. And so that's one way to frame it, sort of like what's going on in your community. Is there stress on wetlands, beaches, coastal areas? What are the types of pollution that are most concerning? And then articulate why the waters are important to you, and what you're hoping our two governments, federally and provincially, are going to commit to doing to achieve that, and sort of, if you want to speak to it in that way, I think that's a helpful commentary for the parties.
Agreed. It's really the local focus is super important. Our next question is, in the absence of First Nations and Métis input to the COA, is there efforts on the part of the Canadian government or Ontario government to reach out to Indigenous input for the COA?
It's certainly our understanding that there are communications between the federal and provincial government and First Nations communities and Métis communities. So it's our understanding that that kind of conversation is going on, but I can't speak for either of those communities because I don't know directly if they're being adequately consulted and meaningfully consulted in the absence of elevating our agreement to being Canada, Ontario nations, First Nations.
The next question is, there's been a suggestion to create a blue belt for waterways feeding into the Great Lakes. How might this fit in? I'll just note that and especially from the ENGO community, there's been a real emphasis and a need to point out the importance of watershed health and how integrated that truly is in the basin in terms of achieving the outcomes of COA. So there's many other groups that can speak to that, more specifically and in a more pointed way, that I know will be making comments and are engaged in the process. But maybe I'll let Anna address this question with any thoughts she has as well.
It's definitely something worth considering in terms of how those interactions fit within the priorities that have been outlined. And also, there is also a consultation that it is a great opportunity to be thinking about the land use and water interactions as the provincial policy statement is reviewed, and that effort of how we're going to help folks understand that process and get engaged in that process on water, as well as on some of the other issues. We'll be rolling that out where there's a little bit more time, because those comments are not due until October. But that's another opportunity to be thinking about kind of that intersection between how we design our communities and use the land and what it means for water.
Okay, great. One more question here. Are those 5 priorities that Anna just spoke to, the 5 topics listed under Article 5, the COA Exec Committee? I might need a little bit of clarification for that question.
They're within the draft agreement on page 9. If you're looking at it, the administration of the agreement, they have 5 columns. The top of those columns are the priorities that I read out, and then the blobs that have each of the names of the annexes are how they fit in. So yeah, if you wanted to, if you're looking at the draft agreement on page 9, and you can see it kind of in a graphic form, what I just blathered on about how they fit together.
Okay, great. And a suggestion in response to the answer on the First Nation Métis question, would it be beneficial for environmental defense and other major ENGOs to reach out to First Nation Métis organizations to work together more on this and other environmental initiatives and commentary opportunities? Yes, and some of that is underway, and relationships have been built, are continuing to grow and evolve, but we just can't speak to whether or not, Anastasia and I can't speak to whether or not First Nations and Métis groups themselves feel they've been adequately consulted. That's for them to decide. So.
Yes, and as Kelsey said, we have definitely been doing some outreach, and not just on COA, but more broadly. It's just started to develop some relationships to try and see if there's a vision that ENGOs and First Nations can articulate that we have in common, and forge that relationships and do our own efforts at reconciliation. And so, yeah, we definitely have that work underway, and I think it's a great suggestion. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Okay, so we're in the last basically 60 seconds of our webinar here. With no questions on the docket, we will take this opportunity to thank you all so much for your participation. It's really great to see so many groups, citizens, organizations, governments interested in this process, in this public consultation. And as we've mentioned a few times, we will be following up with the materials as promised. And once again, feel free to take note of our contact information here and reach out with any follow-up questions you might have. And we look forward to sharing the recording. Please feel free to forward the recording to those you feel would benefit from the information here. and just thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.